to the Wing Space podcast, a place to take up space, a space for you to settle in, sit back, relax, and focus a little bit on health, wellness, faith, family, and this crazy thing called life.
This podcast is not a replacement for mental health treatment or professional health care. In case of crisis or emergency, please contact your local healthcare provider or dial 911.
Welcome to the Wing Space podcast. In today's episode, I will be talking to Meredith Drumm, one of our therapists here at Hope and Healing, about how to communicate with your teen. But first, a quick message about our upcoming services.
Prepare and Enrich is a service that we'll be offering to premarital couples. It is a strength-based program that utilizes assessment portion and then subsequent sessions to look at that assessment and discuss what are your strengths, what are the areas of growth, what are conversations that you'd like to have as you are leading up to and preparing for marriage. One of the nice things about Prepare and Enrich is that it covers not only a wide variety of areas, but it can be utilized with couples that are in different stages of life as well. So maybe this is your first marriage, maybe it is a blending of families that come into play when you are preparing for this. So the idea is that we can support you in that process and support you in having conversations with your partner and planning ahead for success. You can go to the website and send us your information and we'll get back with you, or you can give us a call.
For more information on Prepare and Enrich, visit our website, hopehealingtherapy.com, or call 301-690-8404, extension 0.
Welcome back to the Wing Space podcast, a place to take up space. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with one of our therapists here at Hope and Healing, Meredith Drumm. It's good to have you here with me, Meredith.
Hey, thank you.
And keeping in line with our theme for the month of February about communication and relationships, we're going to talk about how to communicate with our teen. I know we have a lot of parents that listen to this podcast and maybe even some teachers or educators. And as a parent of teens myself, we could all use some tips and tricks on this. So Meredith, do you want to just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself first, and then we can jump into this idea of communicating with our teens?
Sure. Let's see. I've been with Hope and Healing since 2019. I've been a therapist since 2011. I work with mostly kids my whole career. And even outside of being a therapist, all of my jobs have been kid related because I might just be a giant child. And so I like working with kids. Teens tend to be, I don't like to pick a favorite age range because I think there's something fun about every age group, but teens are probably close to my favorite. They have enough open-mindedness, but they also have budding critical thinking skills, which makes conversations with them pretty fun. So they have a fresh look on things usually. So.
Yeah, and I can imagine that some of the parents of the teens that you work with might not have the same outlook on their teenagers' communication as you do.
Yeah, I actually get a little defensive when people in general, not just parents of clients, but like teenagers get a really bad rap, I think, in the world in general. You know, they like, oh, these kids these days and stuff like that. And I think that's really unfair because I am biased because I like teens, but I think they have a lot to offer and they cliche and all, but they are like the future. So,
Right. So maybe let's start with some common mistakes that parents tend to make while they're communicating with their teen. And then we'll get into maybe a little bit more information about what we can do instead.
I think the number one common mistake with teens, but even with all age ranges of kids, is that parents make is talking for too long or like going off on monologues. I see it all the time, and I'm sure you do too in the office, Jen, when parents come in for a family session, which is great and super helpful and very necessary for almost all teens. But there's a reason that they're there, and it's usually something that's emotional. And so emotions are heightened. And when parents get upset and emotions get heightened, they tend to start ranting, and maybe not yelling or screaming, but they have all these thoughts and things bottled up, and then it all just comes out. And so then they're talking for so long. And I can empathize with that as a parent myself, but I can also see the moment in the kids' eyes when they have stopped listening. So when you talk for too long and you go on these long monologues, they're only going to hear about, like the first few sentences. So that's probably the number one common mistake I think that parents make with kids, is just talking and talking and talking, because they're just not listening anymore. I think another one is filling all silences. So when you try to have a conversation and your teen doesn't say anything, and then you feel, I think this is normal with all people, that we're uncomfortable with silences. So then you feel the need to say more words. And again, back to, you should say less words and just wait them out. Eventually, most people find silences uncomfortable. So eventually they will probably say something, and they might just need time to think about what they need to say. Some people need that extra time. And then another one I think is, I don't know if this one applies to like having conversations with your teen so much as it is to like in the office here, or in any office with like maybe like a teacher or a doctor or anything like that, answering questions for your kid, especially by the time they're teens. I think it applies when they're little too, but you are naturally going to have to fill in the blanks when they're smaller, but especially when they're teens, parents, again, I think get uncomfortable if I ask a question, the teen doesn't answer, and then they feel like they know the answer. And so they'll chime in. I don't want them to do that. And I think that applies in, like I said, in a doctor's office, with teachers and educators, even, on the sports fields with coaches, like give them the opportunity to come up with an answer, even if you feel like you know what the answer is, because that's good experience for them in communicating anyway. So.
And most of the adults that they're having that communication with are going to ask additional questions. If the kid gives a, 2-word answer and it's a doctor or a teacher, if they want more information, they're going to seek that rather than the parent trying to fill in the gaps.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Any other mistakes that you see parents making? Or, we could even go so far as to say educators or other adults in kids' lives, that may have some just errors in the way that we engage with teens.
I think educators and other adults they're in a unique position because, it's a little less pressure when it's not your kid, and all of their conversations, well, not all, most conversations tend to be goal oriented, right? So if you're talking with a teacher or an educator, it's going to be usually around what their role is in your life. And the same for like your soccer coach or your doctor or, any of that kind of stuff, your pastor. But, I think the best teachers that I know are the ones that have the conversations with kids that aren't related to, all the teachers in my life. And then the kids I know who I talk to about, teachers that they love are the teachers that they can come to and talk about anything with, and just be. And that usually makes a big difference, I think.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a side note, I guess, but it's really important for teens to have an adult or 2 or 3 outside of their parents that they can talk to. We certainly want our teens talking to parents. We want them to plop down on the couch and say, hey, I got to talk to you. Mm-hmm. But we also want to make sure that they have other adults that they can confide in, because, you and I both know we all have opinions and we all have different perspectives. And sometimes even teenagers need to see those different perspectives so they can consider how to develop their own.
And I think, I don't know that this is a common mistake, but I think sometimes some parents feel threatened by, if your child becomes close with another adult, like, say teacher, coach, like a pastor or youth leader at the church or something like that. But, the more positive adult influences in a kid's life, it really, I think research backs that up, that it really makes more positive outcomes for that kid's life,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my oldest son has a connection with one of the teachers at his high school that was invaluable after my dad passed away. Just for her to be able to give me a little bit of insight as to that he was opening up more. He was talking to friends more. He was kind of engaging in the day more, because all I saw was what I saw at home, not really knowing, how he was doing with things. And his relationship with her is really invaluable. So I agree.
And it doesn't have the stress of what your relationship has with him as your parent, as the parent who is, in charge of consequences and discipline and making sure that everything's on top, and that's what it should be. I mean, we have to as parents, but they need that other adult presence. I was lucky to have a lot of other adults in my life, and my parents were great, but having those other adults was really, really shaped who I am, I think.
Yeah, that's good. And I do like what you say about the dynamic between educators and other adults, folks at church or coaches or mentors in some way. They do have maybe a little less pressure than parents do in terms of, holding kids accountable for everything. They can be more of a sounding board.
Well, and it's just like when working with kids at work versus working with my kids at home, I'm much more level-headed with my clients. I don't have as strong of an emotional attachment. So it gives me the ability to see things more clearly often.
Yeah. And so this might be something that we talk about when we jump into the must-dos with communication with teens. But something you just said made me think of helping parents to understand, and parents, if you're listening, understand that it's okay to step away. It's okay to take time, right? Because we're so emotionally connected to our children that sometimes the emotion is what's driving our engagement with them rather than that level-headedness. And sometimes we need to step away in order to have more of a level head.
Definitely.
So when we're talking about, communicating with our teens, obviously it's important for parents to recognize where they might make some mistakes. And I also want to put out there, the truth of the matter is we all make mistakes in communication. We all have errors in the way that we think. This is not just pointing fingers at parents. This is not just pointing fingers at certain parents or anything like that. It's just in general, we all make mistakes. We're human. There's different variables that come into play. We're tired, we're hungry, we're this, we're that, and it impacts things. So,
well, and I think I think sometimes you think of it as I'm going to be good at this, and it's a destination. But I think communicating with your kid and having healthy communication with your kid, or really, I mean, almost with anybody, it's a journey. There is no finish line, because there's going to be ups and downs,
Well, and from a parenting perspective, you've never parented your child today, and they're growing and developing, and their brain is changing and their body is changing, and hormones are playing a role in everything. Even as they're small children, everything is changing. So while I know what I did to parent my kid yesterday, I've never parented them today with all the things that are happening within their brains and their bodies. And when my almost 16-year-old is almost 18, like the oldest, they're different kids, which means they're going to engage differently. So it's kind of a crapshoot every day to know how to do what we do today. And you're right. It is such a journey.
Yeah. And you just hit on what I was going to say is you would think the more kids you have, the better and easier it would get. But every kid is different, and every kid needs and their own style of communication, their own emotional reactions. They're all different. And so you have to pivot every day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's probably one good place to start in terms of what parents can do for positive communication. And that's the idea of pivoting and being flexible.
Yeah, definitely being flexible. A big one, I will say that I don't know if you've seen this in your work, but what I see is that the parents who tend to have the most open and, honest communication, good relationships with their kids are the parents who make an effort to be interested in something that their kid is interested in. Okay. And I know that can be hard, depending on what your kids' interests are and how old they are. But those are, there's a distinct difference between the parents who, if your kid is really into anime and you could not give a crap about anime, making the effort to actually listen to them talk about it, maybe sit down and watch something with them, that makes them feel connected. That, it makes a huge difference in their willingness to just talk to you. So that is probably the biggest one.
Yeah, that's such a good point. This past fall, our oldest son decided that we as a family were going to have a fantasy football team league, and he signed us all up. Like, we all got the app, and it was a thing. Every week on Thursday, he was making sure everybody had their teams. I had no interest in having a fantasy football team, but he was like, "We should have a team," and I was like, "Okay, let's do it." And it was just really fun, for that period of the NFL season, that we could talk about stats and talk about stuff that I really didn't have much interest in, but I loved seeing his interest in it, and the little friendly competition that was going. There was no stakes, right? There was no money in the game. It was just fun. But I would have never said, let's have a family fantasy football league, but it gave us
came up with the idea. That's cool.
Yes. So thinking outside of the box and realizing that their interests, maybe you might not be interested in it, but you are interested in your kid. So therefore find some interest in what they like.
Yeah. And that kind of plays into another thing that I think is kind of a must do is, I think, listening to your kids when they talk about things that you think aren't very significant or important. I think it's a really good just modeling, because if you don't pay attention and listen to when they talk to you about minor things, then they're not going to come to you with major things. And so, when my son was younger and he went through a phase where he was really into Minecraft, and as a lot of kids do, and I really do not care at all about Minecraft in any way, shape, or form. It seems tedious and mind-numbing to me. But I would sit and try very hard to listen to all the things he had to say about Minecraft. And that's what I would say to myself in my head. I would say, this is important to him. This matters to him. I'm going to do my best to sit here and have this conversation with him. But those minor things really do, if they don't think they can come to you for small things, then they're not going to come to you for big stuff. And that's what you really want.
And our reaction to all those things is important too. If it could be a big thing for them or a small thing for them, but if we respond kind of catastrophically to what they think is a little thing, then they're not going to bring something big to us because they don't want to upset us, right?
And I see that a lot in the office too, is that kids will tell me something that they think is really big and scary, and they're so terrified to tell their parents. And when I hear it, and I know the parents well enough, and I think in my head, I don't think they're going to care that much about this. Like, I don't think that's going to be as big a deal as you think it's going to be. But kids so often have it built up of, I can't tell them, they'll be so upset, it'll be so terrible. And having to have that conversation of, it's not going to be that bad. Like, let's try. And often, not always, but often it isn't that bad. But yeah, I think sometimes I say that, having a good poker face is kind of a necessary skill for parenting. Because when you overreact, then kids tend to system generalize. And so they think you're going to overreact to everything. And, I mean, we're all human. We've all overreacted before, but trying your best to maintain that poker face for sure.
Yeah. And I know you've heard me say this before. We've talked about this with regards to like testifying in court, but when we think about communicating with our teens, communicating with anyone really, just take a breath, swallow the spit that's in your mouth, take a breath before you respond. Because if you just blurt out what's coming, once we say it, we can't bring it back. And, once we shut our teenager down, then it's hard to pull them back in. So just take a breath. It's okay. It doesn't have to be rapid fire communication. We can just slow down and say, you know what, let me think about that for a minute, and even say the words, right? Let me think about that for just a minute.
And that's great modeling for them, because they probably need to learn that skill to do it too. And teenagers' brains aren't done developing yet. And so they might need that extra time to just process what you're saying or what you're going to say or what they've just said.
Yeah. You bring up such a great point about the brain not being fully developed. We here well, a lot of cultures do. I won't just throw American culture under the bus, but we know now that we kind of send our kids, we launch them when they turn 18. They graduate high school, they turn 18, and we launch them into the world. And there's research now that says the brain isn't fully developed until they're 29 years old.
Ooh, I didn't hear that.
It's the most recent research. It used to be between 23 and 26.
Yeah,
and
I always think around 25.
Yeah, and so there's some more recent research that says that it could be closer to 29 before the brain is developed. So, I mean, I know I had 2 kids by the time I was 29. So when we think about, okay, well, I just got to get my kid graduated and quote out the door, right? I mean, even if they still live in your house, but then we start to treat them like adults when their brains are still processing like teenagers. And we really do have to kind of step back and remember that their brains aren't fully functioning yet.
Yeah. Yeah. And parenting is really a lifelong journey. It doesn't stop when your kid turns 18 or 25 or even 45. I rely on my mom for things, emotional support and advice and stuff like that.
Sure.
And I know, most adults I know do that. So I would say another must do though, and this is something that I do probably every day as a parent, is apologize. That's a really big one. Because kind of going back to what we talked about, how we all make mistakes and nobody's perfect as a parent. I snapped at my daughter last night because for a common theme in my house and many households is we're trying to get out the door for gymnastics, and she's fallen behind, and I snapped at her, and I had to stop and apologize because I overreacted. That was a definite overreaction on my part. And yes, would it be better if I could prevent it from happening in the first place? Sure. But that's probably an unrealistic expectation as a human being. Like, you try to do better, but when you fall short, you own up to it, which is also good modeling for your kid.
Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing about modeling because, so many times kids will say, "Oh, I'm sorry," and it's just this kind of
reaction.
It's just, I'm sorry. Well, I'm sorry for what? So if we as adults can say, I may or may not have had the same interaction this morning at my own house where I do need to say and have myself said, I'm sorry that I overreacted. It was not necessary. I'm sorry it made you feel whatever, kind of fill in the blanks, not only saying I'm sorry, but what am I sorry for? And also with teenagers, we not only do we have to show interest in things that they're interested in, but we have to speak their language, aka it's okay to text them.
Yeah. Oh,
it's okay to text them and say, hey, I'm sorry for whatever, because they might engage back with you via text, whereas at home, okay, and then they walk upstairs. So understanding that whether we like it or not, our kids communicate via text. And not all of our communication should be that way, but maybe sometimes it is.
Well, the other thing with teenagers that I realize is that, and I'm sure you've seen this too, that it requires, like, their processing time is faster than when they were 6, but still not up to where, fully formed brains would be. And so what you've said might not sink into them until later that day or even the next couple days. And so texting can be helpful with that too, because then it gives them the time and space to kind of really process and think about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think another one is minimizing distractions when you talk to your teenagers. Any kid really, but I think the car is always a nice place. If you're going to have a conversation, the car is actually a good place because you're all in there anyway. You have time to kill. Nobody can go anywhere. It's not a good place to have I would say, like, heated, tense conversation, because that's uncomfortable and can be a recipe for miscommunications. But, when you need to have some sort of heart-to-heart kind of conversation, the car can always be a good place. Because if you're trying to talk to them while they're playing video games or snapping with their friends, they've got, one foot out the door, which makes conversations much harder.
Well, and I can imagine that, well, I shouldn't say I can imagine. I know that timing is important too. right? So you just said while they're playing a game, I might need to have a conversation with my kid. If right now, while they're playing that game is the exact moment I have to have that conversation, they're already going to enter that conversation annoyed because I made them turn off their game. Most conversations could wait a few minutes and say, hey, when you finish that game, I need you to come downstairs. I need to chat with you about something, so that they can finish their game. They can come downstairs, because otherwise they're going to end up already annoyed that you made them get off their game. So we have to have some interesting timing for conversations too.
Yeah, definitely. And validating their emotions is a big one, I think, too. Kind of maybe, what they call it, like a compliment sandwich, I think, where, you put criticism in between two compliments. I don't know if you have to do that specifically, but empathizing and trying to see it from their perspective, even if there are still consequences and, like disciplinary measures that need to be made, you can still empathize and kind of validate how they're feeling about the situation. Just to give them that level of validation is usually pretty helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other important things that parents can keep in mind when talking with teens?
I think something that kind of maybe falls off the wayside with teens, but happens more when they're younger, is praise. We give a lot of praise to toddlers and little kids because they're just learning how to do things and it's exciting. And for the most part, most kids are just at that age are just happy all the time. And teens can be, aloof and they like to isolate and hang out in their bedrooms and, only talk to their friends, and they might seem grumpy more often than not. But that doesn't mean that they don't still really thrive on praise and encouragement. And so just finding something that you can praise them on, even if it's very small, every day, every other day, it probably do a lot for their self-worth and how they are feeling in general, but also just for your relationship with them. Praise is a big one.
Yeah, and sometimes people assume that praise is, you did a great job, like similar to what we do when the kids are little, but sometimes praise can come in the form of a thank you, and it sometimes has to be a really big grasp, right? Thanks for bringing that trash downstairs. It, saved me from having to make that extra step, realizing that the trash was overflowing on the floor and they were stepping in it. And that's the only reason why they cleaned it up and to begin with. But you know what? They brought the trash down. So that's what we're going to stop there.
Away from that interaction thinking like, oh, that was a good thing I did. I might want to repeat that. And maybe in the future, they will do it before it's overflowing.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe not immediately, but eventually in the future, yeah.
Well, and I mean, teens or adults, just the idea of saying I'm sorry and then saying I'm sorry, what am I sorry for, but also thank you, and why is the thing that you did for me helpful? What's the impact on me? And why am I apologizing for the impact I had on you, can be helpful to, instead of as just, thank you. Well, thank you for what? What did I do? I mean, sometimes I've actually had my own kids say, thank you for what? And then I'm like, oh, thank you for, and then I finish the sentence. And then that's when, like you said, they'll say, oh, well, maybe I want to do that again.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Anything specific that you can think of in terms of, we've got these teenagers, right? We've got these kiddos that are not quite children, not quite teenagers. They're kind of stuck in this middle area of awkwardness. And that could be a whole nother conversation for another day. But any quick little tips about talking to those children and how it might be different, or is it just some more of the same?
I think with the tweens, I think all the stuff that we already talked about definitely still applies, but I think because it depends on like the day and their mood on how they want to be treated. And sometimes I think as parents, it's impossible to figure that out. Like, do they want to be babied, or do they want to be treated like they're like not a baby anymore, as, a lot of tweens will say. And, remembering that sometimes they do need still that like little kid coddling and I mean, I think teenagers need that sometimes too, honestly. Yeah. And then trying to recognize when to let them fly, grow their wings,
Mm-hmm.
test some limits, test some
Yeah.
independence, which I think is really hard as parents because that can be terrifying. But
Yeah.
I think that's usually, it's just the figuring out the balance between those
Mm-hmm.
these tweens.
Yeah. You mentioned the idea of, the coddling, and that made me think of cuddling, which led me to this quick little idea about physical contact. And I think sometimes we forget that our teenagers need hugs and they need, pats on the back. And at some point in my kids' lives, we started doing the T-Rex hug. And I don't really know where it came from, but, little short arms, and so I think one time my kid was like, I don't want to hug mom. And I was like, okay, just give me a little hug. And so he named it the T-Rex hug.
Yeah.
Every single time we have a T-Rex hug, it leads to a regular hug, right? So I kind of speak their language and I'm like, okay, just a little T-Rex hug. And maybe you come up with something that's fun with your own teen that allows you to have some physical contact with them, because we can sometimes go a long time without giving our kid a hug because, they're in and out, they're up and down, they're going to school, they're coming in, and we don't just stop to like show them a little bit of physical affection. And that idea of the T-Rex hug has really helped us to be able to, be silly. And then I'm like, okay, give me a real one. And then, I mean, hugs are nice and it's important for our social development and our relationships and
For our nervous
speaking their language.
Yeah.
Anything else for our parents out there today, Meredith, that you want them to hear about communicating with their kiddo?
The only other thing I thought of, and I think this one's exceptionally hard, is knowing when to let go in an argument. Not arguing about how they feel about something, even if you think they're lying, it's
Mm-hmm.
not worth arguing about it, right? Because then you're undermining their emotions, right? And so if they're telling you how they feel about something and you're feeling skeptical, keeping that skepticism to yourself. But feelings aside, learning to recognize when the argument's just not worth it. And for every kid I know who argues and has to be right, there is at least one parent who has that trait. And that's true in my house too. So for sure, and so, as hard as it might be, recognizing like they don't need to agree with me. I don't need to point out how they're wrong. I'm just gonna, we're just gonna go with whatever the nice natural consequences and disciplinary measures are and agree to disagree on either what's happened or how we think about it or whatever the issue is. And I know that one's hard, but I see that a lot.
Yeah. The more we talk, the more I realize that we could probably talk all day long about this and the interesting way that we can communicate with our teens. But for the sake of today, I think we've shared a lot of information with our listeners, and I really appreciate all of your insight. I know you've had many, many years of working with teenagers and making sure that you're communicating in a way that helps them to be the best that they can be. So thanks for sharing that wisdom with us today. And for our listeners, we appreciate you helping us to dive into this and continuing to listen to us. If you have your own thoughts and ideas, we'd love to hear them. You can always send us a DM through our socials, or you can email me, Jennifer@hopehealingtherapy.com. And thanks for listening. Have a great day.